Mark presents for us that Jesus' primary antagonists are this group of people called the Pharisees or the scribes. And we've talked a little bit about them here and there, but they will become central figures throughout the rest of Mark's telling of Jesus' life. And that it seems like one of the major problems that the Pharisees have with Jesus is the way that he treats the Sabbath day. Interestingly enough, that in our world, that this issue of Sabbath has actually continued to become a problem. What is a Sabbath? When is the correct day to take Sabbath? What should you be doing on the Sabbath? What day of the week is a Sabbath? All of those questions are there. And I want us to take a look at the end of Mark chapter 2 and the beginning of Mark chapter 3 and take a look at some of the controversy that's there, and then also come to what is a good thing, that's a good Sabbath-keeping practice for us that are looking to follow the way of Jesus. And so we're going to dive into that together. Let's take a look at Mark chapter 2. I'm going to read Mark chapter 2, verse 23 through chapter 3, verse 5. And it says this: One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and he gave it to those who were with him?" And Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again, he entered the synagogue, and there was a man with a withered hand, and the Pharisees watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And Jesus said to the man, said to them all, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart. And he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. This point of conflict between the Pharisees and Jesus ends up becoming the spark point, the place where the real anger and division between the Pharisees and Jesus really takes off, is about the Sabbath controversy. There's a couple of important principles that Jesus discusses about Sabbath in these two passages that we just read together. The first is the fact that Jesus himself is Lord even of the Sabbath, which means that Jesus himself is the one who controls all of this. We don't get to dictate back to God what Sabbath is and is not, but rather that Jesus sets the agenda for Sabbath. The second principle that we learn is Jesus says that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. It's an awkward phrase for us, but that essentially what Jesus is trying to get at is that the Sabbath was not meant to be slavishly observed, like that if we are obligated in some way to fulfill this, in that we become a slave unto the observance of our Sabbath, but rather that the Sabbath was created for man. I want to take a moment there and think through that. In the Old Testament, that Sabbath is established first in Genesis chapter 2, where God rested and made the seventh day holy, but then also that God establishes an observance of a day of rest for the people of Israel. It's important for us to understand that Sabbath in the Old Testament started first and foremost as a day of rest, a day of ceasing of the normal activities of daily life. You don't go to work that day. You don't go out into the fields and reap a harvest. You don't put your animals to the plow on that day. And that it's very clear in Deuteronomy chapter 5 that when God presents Israel with the observance of Sabbath, it is because they were slaves in Egypt that they are given a day of rest. It's a reminder that their Lord is not the needs of material needs of food, of water, of shelter, of wealth. that rather their God and their Lord is the God of the heavens and the earth, and that he is the one who will sustain them and care for them, and so that God has given them a day to rest. What's interesting there is that God does not establish the Sabbath as a day of quote unquote worship. And this is where the controversy today comes, is that we say, what is the appropriate day of Sabbath? And that what people mean by that question is that what is the appropriate day for the people who are called by God's name to gather together for a public service of worship? This is using the term Sabbath incorrectly. Sabbath is a day of rest, not a day of worship. That people started to gather for public worship service in the synagogues following the exile that you can read about in the end of 2 Kings and the end of 2 Chronicles, when the Babylonians and Assyrians took Israel out of the land, and that they needed a place to worship because they didn't have the temple any longer. And so that they established these local bodies called synagogues where people would gather together to worship. And they would gather together on Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath day. Now, part of this controversy, and it's important for us to understand, why then does the vast majority of the church gather for worship on Sunday? Well, the reason why is that Jesus was raised on the first day of the week, and that we as people who follow Jesus worship on the day of his resurrection, the day of the new creation, the day of new life, that we gather together to worship the one who was raised to life on the first day of the week. So it's not that Sunday necessarily is quote unquote our Sabbath day, or even Saturday is quote unquote the Sabbath day, but rather God is instructing us that the Sabbath was made for us, that we would rest and pause from our normal daily activities to rest with him, to come into his presence, to recognize that he is our Lord. He is the one that is in control of us and protects us and provides for us. The third principle that we can glean from this is that Sabbath observance, particularly among the Jewish people, sometimes meant just ceasing from all activity. If that rest was the goal of the Sabbath, then they should do nothing. And that Jesus asks this question in chapter 3, verse 4, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save a life or to kill? And what Jesus was getting at with that statement is that it is still proper to do good on the Sabbath day. On your day of rest does not mean that you cease from doing the good things that God is asking you to do. So that he actually gets angered at this when he recognizes that people are so bent on fulfilling their particular obligation to this one day of the week that they say this is the day that we are supposed to rest, and we're not allowed to do anything except these specific things. And Jesus says, no, if someone is in need, help them. If you are required to do good on the Sabbath. So I encourage you, if someone is pressing you in to say, this is the day of worship, you're supposed to worship and gather on the Sabbath day, I want you to remember these passages from Mark chapter 2 and chapter 3, and recognize that the person who is sharing that with you is sharing from the depth of their conviction, but that you would remember that Jesus has called you to your day of rest, not a day of worship that is being presented to you, but that a day of rest where you can be renewed in the presence of God, and that you can then follow Jesus in faithfulness and with fullness of faith towards him, and that you could be his child fully